Hi everyone, since it's December, I've been wanting to do some end of year recap videos, and today I'm starting out with a look back at my least favorite, worst, most disappointing books from 2020. I do try not to be too negative on this channel. I made a video about this before, about my philosophy of reviewing, and in general, I try not to say anything that would be really hurtful to an author or creator if they saw my review. But since this is an entire video of me talking about the books I did not enjoy in 2020, I think it's fairly reasonable to expect that there might be some snark and negativity, and I hope that everyone will realize that this is just my opinion. I don't think it's bad if anybody liked some of these books, and I hope that it won't hurt anybody's feelings. So I'm going to talk about my 10 least favorite or most disappointing books from 2020. Some of these are going to be books that I read and just didn't like very much, and others will be books that I had really high expectations for and felt disappointed by. So maybe they aren't, particularly bad on their own, but just compared to what I was hoping for, they ended up not meeting those expectations. At the end, I'll also mention a couple special, I guess I'll call them honorable mention categories. I'll talk about the books that I DNF'd this year, the books that I didn't finish. There aren't too many of those. I usually finish books unless I get really stuck on things. I'll also talk about a few books at the end in what I'll call the what was I thinking category. These are books that might be really good, but are just books that I shouldn't have read and probably should have known that they wouldn't be for me. These are not ranked in any way. This is just the order that I have them in my notes, which is just the order that I thought of them in as I was looking over what I read in the past year. First off, we have Angel of the Crows by Catherine Addison. So The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison was one of my favorite books that I read this year. Honestly, it might be one of my favorite books of all time. It's definitely in my top favorites list. I thought it was an amazing book. It was one of the first things that I ever reviewed on this channel, and even though I think I've gotten a lot better at making videos since then, I think a lot of my opinions still stand. It's a really phenomenal character study, just a really powerful, emotional book, kind of slow in some ways, but in a really beautiful way. Very different than a lot of fantasy that's out there these days, or just in general. It's a standalone, but this isn't about the Goblin Emperor. This is about the Angel of the Crows. So Catherine Addison hadn't published anything since the Goblin Emperor. I can't remember exactly how long ago that was, but it's been quite a few years. So she's not an author that has published a lot. And then Angel of the Crows is a Sherlock Holmes retelling. It's basically a retelling of several of the classic Sherlock Holmes stories, except that there are angels and Sherlock is an angel named Crow, and there are other supernatural creatures, and other than that, it's a really straightforward retelling of the classic stories. I didn't even do a review of this book. I did talk about it in a wrap-up, and at the time I said it was okay, and it is. I still think that Catherine Addison is a really good writer, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else she does when she hopefully publishes more books. But the more I've thought about this book in retrospect, the more disappointed I am. It was just from the person that did something so original and powerful like the Goblin Emperor. I mean, I have nothing against fan fiction. Fan fiction is awesome. A lot of people really enjoy reading and writing fan fiction, and I've read fan fiction myself. But I really wasn't looking for Sherlock Holmes fan fiction from Catherine Addison. I just wasn't, and the story was just not that original, even though, I mean, Vampire Moriarty had its moments, but it just, I don't even like the original Sherlock Holmes stories that much compared to all the adaptations and things that have been written since then. So yeah, it was a disappointment. I think expectations were probably really high on this author, and it was what it was, but it wasn't great. The video on my channel that has the most views right now is my review of A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown, which is a little bit sad because it's the only rant review that I've ever done in my life. This is a book that got a lot of hype around release. I saw a few positive reviews of it and then just silence. So I feel a little worse than I did at the time about making this negative review, because I thought at the time that a lot of people were reading it, there were going to be a ton of positive reviews, and I think there were some, but I expected to hear more about this book given the buzz around it. Maybe it's just that I'm not really in YA circles. So you can watch that review if you want to know exactly why I didn't like that book, but it was a combination of the plot for me being a little bit shallow. I didn't really enjoy the way the characters were developed, and then there were just a few things in it that really super triggered me. I think I have about a 5-minute rant around how a musical performance was portrayed in that video. So yeah, basically the book, I mean, it really is okay. I think some people would really enjoy that book. It's just, it was a combination of it being kind of mediocre for me, and then a few things about it that I really didn't like. Maybe A Song of Wraiths and Ruin should have been on my what was I thinking list, because I do have this tendency to pick up YA and then be super disappointed in it. I'm working on that. I think my problem is that I like strong female protagonists and non-Western fantasy settings, but I don't necessarily like some of the storytelling conventions or the writing styles that are popular in a lot of YA that gets published, although I do have YA books that I like. I feel like I should keep saying that. Next is a book that really disappointed me. This might be a very unpopular opinion, but Shorefall by Robert Jackson Bennett, I just did not really enjoy it that much. I mean, I enjoyed reading it okay, but I really liked Foundryside, and I was really looking forward to the sequel. For me, Foundryside was a book that was sort of on the border of being really, really good. There were things about it that I really, really liked. There's a great magic system. I liked the characters a lot. The plot was fun. So I think it was sort of climbing towards being a great book, but somehow I just wasn't 100% sold. And I was really hoping that Shorefall would be the book that completely got me sucked into this series, and instead it was kind of a letdown. It had a lot of the charms that made Foundryside a good book to me. I thought the magic system was still well handled. It continued to be developed really well. The plot itself was exciting. The writing was still good. I think the book really fell short in two areas for me. First of all, there was this time skip at the beginning of the book that to me really skipped over what should have been a bunch of necessary character development and just put the characters in kind of a weird place in terms of where they're at and their relationships to each other at the beginning of that book. It really didn't feel earned, and it just really threw me out of the story. The other issue I had with it is there was this seriously overpowered villain who, I don't want to give any spoilers, but basically this villain basically comes in and just starts wailing on everybody, and they spend most of the book basically being crushed. And I don't want to say how it ends, but honestly, I just didn't find it fun to read because I never felt like the heroes had any kind of chance in the entire book. And I just don't like villains that are that overpowered. Oh, and there was sort of excessive reliance on flashbacks as a dramatic device, which is sort of I'll call that a minor sin in fantasy. The expository flashback. The problem is, I think, when authors imagine a flashback, it's like so epic and all this stuff is getting revealed and it's so cool and they've been building towards it for years. And then as a reader, sometimes you just read them and you're like, okay, cool, that happened. Another book I haven't heard too much about, but that just didn't work for me, was City of Lies by Sam Hawke. This is one that I really kind of forced myself to finish. I feel like I see the intentions that the author had behind it, and I think I could see why this would be a book that I think maybe it really resonated with some people, or it could really connect with some people. I think it's intended to be a story about how the main characters realize that their city and their culture is very oppressive towards a minority culture and all the bad things that are happening around that. But I just didn't feel like that was very well executed. I also felt like there were these two main characters, a brother and sister, and we had narration from both of them, and I could not tell their voices apart. It was just really frustrating because I would pick up the book and I wouldn't know whose point of view I was in for pages and pages and pages until I got a name or something. So to me, it felt a little bit flat, but I could see why this would be a book that some people would really connect with in terms of the characters or the theme. I just didn't really enjoy the execution. The next one is a book that I haven't talked about on the channel really because I read it before I started the channel. I think I read it probably in January or February, and that was Angel Mage by Garth Nix. I am not a huge Garth Nix fan, but I enjoyed Sabriel back in the day. I think it was fairly popular when I was around middle school age, so a while ago. The reason I picked up Angel Mage primarily is because it had a strong Three Musketeers flavor, and that's basically enough for me. I'll pick up anything that looks remotely related to the Three Musketeers. It's just a huge favorite of mine. And in that sense, this book didn't really disappoint. It was basically a gender-bent sort of Three Musketeers retelling with a very different villain plot and angel magic, and yeah, I mean, it was okay. I think if it wasn't for the Three Musketeers stuff, I wouldn't have really been into it at all, but it kind of entertained me. Like, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't think it was good. This kind of goes against what I said when I was talking about The Angel of the Crows, but I kind of wish this had been just a more straightforward Three Musketeers retelling at that point, because I didn't feel like the added elements really helped anything, and the villain's motivation was kind of stupid in the end. Another book that I thought could have been really cool, but that I just really didn't like, was Magic for Liars by Sarah Gailey. This is a book about a private investigator who is the sister of someone who has magic and goes to sort of a contemporary, I don't really want to call it a Hogwarts style school, but a school for magic users. And the private investigator does not have magic, and she gets called in to investigate a crime at this magic school. And so when this non-magical character is put in this magical situation, she basically makes a lot of really stupid choices. And then she is surrounded by teenagers who are all terrible people. So basically, I just thought everyone in this book was awful, and I didn't really like very much about it at all. And I'm sorry if you liked it. I'm not necessarily saying I think it's a bad book. I just think I did not like any of the characters, and I really didn't like the plot. So yeah, that was it for me. Another book that I just did not care for at all was Record of a Spaceborne Few by Becky Chambers. This is the third book in the Wayfarers series. I guess I'll file this under the category of disappointing, because I really liked the first two books in the series. The first one was A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, and the second one was A Closed and Common Orbit. The first one I liked quite a lot. It didn't have a ton of plot, but it had a lot of other really great elements. And then the second book I really loved. And then in the third book, Record of a Spaceborne Few, I think literally nothing happened in the entire book. I mean, there were a few plot events, but it really took the storylessness of the first book to such an extreme that I just couldn't handle it. And I don't mind slow character-driven books. I love slow character-driven books, and this book was just too slow and character-driven. But the nice thing is the books in this series are basically standalones. There is some carryover in characters between the books, or some, characters that maybe make a cameo in one book that are central characters in another book, but you can read them all independently, and that's fine. So I was disappointed in this book, but I will totally continue reading the series, and I really like the first two. So this is not in any way a criticism of the overall series. I just didn't like that book. It was boring. As I was looking back to my spreadsheet of books that I read in the first quarter of the year, which was before I started the channel, I saw there were two books that I didn't particularly care for, and the really funny thing is I didn't realize until I was making notes for this video that they're actually by the same author, so that's probably just sending me a strong message. I think probably if I had realized that after reading the first book I didn't care for, that this other one had the same author, I probably wouldn't have read another book by her. So the author is Lisa Goldstein, and the first book I read was called Ivory Apples. I thought it started out super interesting, and then maybe about 2/3 of the way through, maybe even half of the way through, it just took a turn for the extreme weird, and I was just not very happy with anything that happened in the book after that, and it was just kind of a bust for me. Sometimes that's the worst kind of disappointment, is a book that starts out really strong and you're hooked, and then it just doesn't execute and you're just not happy with how it's going at all. The second book I read by her was Strange Devices of the Sun and Moon. This was an Elizabethan fantasy, and it was just a book that didn't really make an impression on me. I feel like I've seen the Christopher Marlowe and Fey magic thing done before, and probably done better, and I barely remember anything about it other than that I didn't really like it. So I guess the lesson I could draw from this is that this is probably just not an author for me, and I should have paid more attention maybe when I picked up the second book by her this year. The last book I'll mention is the only nonfiction book on this list. It's All Relative by A.J. Jacobs. I've mentioned this book maybe 3 or 4 times already because it took me so long to read it, and it was a really light, easy read. I just wasn't very interested, and I don't know why I kept going, except that it seemed silly to not finish it when it was such a light read. In this book, A.J. Jacobs, who's a journalist, was basically just exploring the nature of family trees and genetics and this idea that we're all related, somewhere back there. And as a device, he organized, in real life, what was intended to be a huge family reunion for, the entire human race, and to see how many people he could get. But basically, it was just a very superficial exploration of a pretty interesting topic. I think that if you have a serious interest in genealogy, it'll be too superficial, but that if you don't, it just isn't the most interesting book anyway. So that was kind of a disappointment for me because I thought it sounded really interesting. I liked the premise. Some of his other books do sound interesting. I might try something else by him in the future, but that was just, I think that one deserves to be on my sort of most disappointing books of 2020 because it just took me like 2 months to read this really short nonfiction book because I just wasn't into it. Okay, now let's talk about my DNFs, the books I didn't finish this year. There weren't very many of them. In general, I think I tend to finish things that I start. I don't have a problem necessarily with putting aside a book if it's really not working for me, but I also don't mind powering through a little bit. For a solid chunk of the spring and summer, I was working on this Hugo Awards reading project, which means that I was reading all the books that were finalists in certain categories for the Hugo Award. So I was reading, I think, all the finalists for Best Novel and for Best Series, although for Best Series, I was just reading the first book in each series because there were some long series in there. So 2 out of my 3 DNFs were from that list. They were things that I probably would not have tried normally and was not quite able to get through. The first one was Luna New Moon by Ian MacDonald from the Luna series. This has been described as Game of Thrones on the moon, and although we tend to joke about how many things, well, basically everything, gets compared to Game of Thrones these days, but in this case, it's really kind of true because there were politics, feuding families, and backstabbing, and then a lot of graphic content. I don't have a real problem with graphic content, but this book was just too much for me for kind of the same reasons that Game of Thrones has become too much for me as an adult. It felt like it was just about gross people doing gross things to themselves and each other, and that just wasn't really my thing. So I think some people really like this kind of story, and I have no problem with that, but I put it down telling myself I was going to come back to it, and then I just never came back to it, and eventually I had to admit that I just didn't want to read it. The other book that I DNF'd from the Hugo Awards was City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Jane Anders. I just couldn't get into it. I couldn't muster up an interest, and I had already really been bored by another book by Charlie Jane Anders that had a ton of critical acclaim, so something about her writing in my brain just doesn't work. I'm sure she's a great writer. I don't really know what my problem with her writing style is, but it doesn't go in. So I stopped reading that one as well. But overall, I really enjoyed doing that Hugo Awards reading project, and there were a number of other books that I wouldn't normally have picked up and that weren't really for me, but I still am glad that I had the opportunity to read them. The only other book that I DNF'd this year was Storm Song, which was the sequel to Witchmark by C.L. Polk. I overall liked Witchmark. It wasn't my favorite book ever, but it was, I solidly enjoyed it. I was looking forward to the sequel, although I was surprised because I felt kind of like the first book, Witchmark, wrapped up pretty neatly with those characters. But Storm Song, the sequel, is about the sister of the main character in the first one, and for some reason, I just couldn't get into it. I couldn't read it. I don't know why. I couldn't tell you. I don't know what my problem was with it, but I tried a couple times and I was just not interested. I didn't care about the characters and I couldn't read it. That doesn't happen to me very often. So there may be absolutely nothing wrong with this book at all. Just for some reason, whenever I was trying to read it, I just couldn't get into it at all. Okay, now I'll do my last category of books, which I will call the What Was I Thinking category. These are books that may be really great, but that I should have probably known better than to read. There could be a few different reasons why it's a What Was I Thinking book, but I think the classic example is a book I read in 2019 called The Last Astronaut. The premise seemed like it was a book about an astronaut who had been on a failed mission, and I think that led to the end of the space program or something like that. And now there was first contact and she had to go into space and deal with that. So that sounded really interesting. And then I looked up the book right before I started reading it and saw that it was described as sci-fi horror. And for some reason, even though I deal really badly with horror and things that are gross, basically, any kind of body horror especially, I decided to keep reading because I felt the description of the book sounded interesting. And yeah, I was pretty traumatized. There were tentacle aliens that turned people into zombies, and that's exactly what I don't want to read ever. I kind of felt like I needed to scrub my brain with sand after reading that book. And again, some people really like that kind of stuff, but for me, I don't want tentacles or zombies or, things like that. So that was last year, but that's just so you know the kinds of bad decisions that I am prone to making. So the first book that is a What Was I Thinking book was Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I know that Leigh Bardugo's books are pretty popular. I know that people have very mixed opinions on their quality, and I know that I am not a huge YA fan. So I decided to read Shadow and Bone because I was curious, and I guess I also, again, I thought, okay, it seems kind of Russian inspired, female protagonist, this sounds cool, except that it was exactly the kind of YA book that I don't like at all, and I probably could have figured that out if I'd thought about it for 2 seconds before deciding to read it. Also, I really liked Leigh Bardugo's dark adult book called Ninth House, so that also probably led to my decision to read Shadow and Bone, but yeah, that book, I don't really even want to talk about why it didn't work for me because it was just so obvious why it wouldn't work for me and I should have known better. Another YA mistake, and there are other YA mistakes that I made that are not on this list, but here is one that I just especially didn't care for. It was called Forest of a Thousand Lanterns by Julie C. Dow, and it was a fairy tale retelling from the point of view of the evil queen in, I guess, Snow White, probably, set in kind of a fantasy China. And it's basically the story about how she becomes evil, and basically in the book, she becomes evil. That's it, that's the story. So maybe I shouldn't have necessarily known better on this one, but again, it does have all the hallmarks of the YA books that I choose to read and then end up really disliking. Next was Rosewater by Tade Thompson. I think this is a really good book. Again, I think it's probably a great series. It's the Rosewater trilogy. This was nominated for the Hugo Award for Best Series. And again, it just had really strong horror elements. But I decided to read it because it was part of the Hugo Awards reading project. So it wasn't really a what were you thinking book because I was reading it for a specific reason and I read it. I knew it might not be for me going in and it wasn't, and that's fine. So I did know going in that I probably wouldn't really like it, and it had more horror or like body horror elements than I really expected. That was a little traumatizing. Again, I kind of wanted to scrub my brain with sand to cleanse some of the images that were with me after reading that. But I think it's a trilogy that a lot of people really like. Again, it's received a lot of critical acclaim, and I think there are great things about it. I just don't like horror. The last book that I'll mention in this category, it's really a shame because I actually think it's an amazing book, and that's Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. If you like horror at all, please go read this book. She is such a good writer. It's such a good book. Like, everything about it is really good. It's just, I decided to read it knowing that it was Gothic horror by thinking, well, classic Gothic horror doesn't really have that many horror elements, or, when it does, they usually aren't that disturbing. I love, Jane Eyre and Rebecca and things like that that are, yeah, maybe those are more like borderline Gothic horror anyway. So I decided to read this book because I really liked the previous book I'd read by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and she is a stunning author. I am so excited to keep reading her, but man, was the end of that book gross, and I really regret reading it. And even more, I regret the fact that it was so well written that I couldn't stop reading it, even though it was disturbing me. So I guess you can see from this, my two issues are YA that sounds good and horror that sounds good. So those are two things I should probably try to steer a little bit more clear of in the future. Thanks for watching. I hope this was fun, even though it was a little bit more of a negative video than I usually do. Let me know down in the comments if there are any books that you really regret reading or were disappointed by. Overall, I feel like I read a lot of great books this year, and even some of the ones that were on my most disappointing list, I can't really say that I think they're bad books. They just either didn't work for me or I was just disappointed in how they worked out. So I think 2020 has been a pretty fun reading year in general, and I'm looking forward to maybe doing a video soon of my favorite books from 2020.